This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about turning devastation into power and heartbreak into the ultimate act of revenge. Picture this: everything you thought was solid, every relationship you held dear, crumbles right before your eyes. And when the dust settles, instead of falling apart, you take that pain and mold it into something no one sees coming, a calculated, public reckoning. A few years ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting here, unraveling my own life like a twisted plot from a thriller, I would have laughed. Drama? That was for other people. But when the people you trust most become the ones who hurt you the deepest, sometimes the only way forward is to strike back harder than anyone ever expects. So, listen closely. This story has it all: betrayal, lies, and a plan that took me from the lowest point in my life to a place where I was calling the shots. I'm going to lay it out for you, piece by piece, without pulling any punches. Because this isn't about pity, it's about getting even, and about what happens when the ones who think they're untouchable get hit where it hurts the most. Trust me, you'll want to stay till the very end. You're not just going to hear about betrayal, you're going to witness what real, cold-blooded retribution looks like. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. My family didn't have much, but we got by. My dad was an electrician who put in long hours, and my mom stayed home to hold everything together. They were the old-fashioned kind of folks: argue all you want, but you don't quit on each other. Divorce? That wasn't even a possibility. Naturally, I grew up thinking marriage was forever. Once you took those vows, that was it, you stayed loyal and worked through the tough times. That belief? Well, it set me up for a heartbreak I never saw coming. I guess that's where my stubborn sense of commitment came from. Growing up seeing my parents stick it out, no matter what, made me expect too much, from myself and from others. I had it in my head that if I worked hard enough, I could fix any relationship. My first marriage? I thought I could save that, too. Spoiler alert, I was dead wrong. My first wife and I were young, way too young. We jumped into everything: marriage, buying a house, even talking about kids, all without really thinking it through. But when reality hit, with money troubles and her realizing we didn't really fit together, it all unraveled. That's when I learned what real betrayal feels like. She left me for another guy, someone who, I guess, seemed a lot more thrilling than I was. And there I was, left standing alone, picking up the pieces of a life I thought was set in stone. But here's the thing, that didn't break me. If anything, it made me even more determined. I swore that next time, I wouldn't let myself be blindsided. And then, I met her. Let's call her Emily. We bumped into each other at a mutual friend's party in Phoenix. I wasn't looking for anything serious, still bruised from my first marriage, but Emily had this spark, this magnetism that just pulled me in. She was the kind of woman who could brighten up any room and make you feel like you were the only one there. She made me forget all the heartache I'd gone through. At first, we took things slow, nothing too heavy. Our first date wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet dinner at Rosa's Bistro, this little Italian place I'd always liked. But that night, it wasn't about the food, it was the conversation. She was smart, quick on her feet, and never backed down from a challenge. I remember thinking to myself, this is it. This is the kind of woman I could build a life with. We both had our share of baggage, but it felt like together, we could handle anything that came our way. Of course, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Every couple goes through rough patches, like the time I lost my job, and we had to scrape by on her paycheck alone. But we made it through, or at least, I thought we did. Looking back now, with the clarity of hindsight, I can see all the warning signs I missed. Red flags I was too blind, or maybe just too hopeful, to notice back then. But before I dive into that, let me introduce you to my best friend. Let's call him Mike. Mike and I go way back to our college days. We were at Arizona State University, both full of big dreams and ambitions. He wasn't just a friend, he was more like a brother to me. We did everything together: road trips, parties, we even landed our first jobs at the same place after graduation. When my first marriage hit the rocks, Mike was the one who helped me through it. He was always there, solid as a rock, and I trusted him with everything. So naturally, he was the first person I introduced to Emily. The three of us even went on a road trip to Sedona, no drama, just a good time. I never thought twice about it back then. But now I can't help but wonder how much I missed. I thought I had everything under control. Emily and I slipped into a comfortable routine, dreaming about the future, talking about kids, planning vacations, and even eyeing a bigger house. We weren't rolling in money, but we were doing fine. After everything I'd been through, I finally felt like I had it all, a stable home, a woman I loved, and a best friend who was as close as family. But family life has a sneaky way of lulling you into a false sense of security. You get so wrapped up in the day-to-day rhythm, in the chores and weekend plans, that you miss the cracks forming beneath your feet. We spent our weekends lounging around, binge-watching shows, making plans for the future, and imagining what life would be like with a couple of kids running around. To me, that meant everything was perfect. But stability? It's just a mirage when the ground beneath you is already shifting. I know what you're probably wondering, when did it all start to go wrong? The truth is, you never see it coming at first. Betrayal doesn't announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. You don't recognize it because you don't want to recognize it. With Mike, I thought we were like brothers. If something was off, I was sure he'd tell me. He'd always had my back, and I'd had his, too. Never in a million years did I imagine that my best friend and my wife would betray me like this. But here I am, laying it all out. It started small, with little things that, looking back now, seem so obvious. But at the time, I was too caught up being the content, trusting husband to see them for what they were. Emily had always been an open book. We'd share everything, texts, stories, and inside jokes. But slowly, that started to change. I still remember the first time I noticed her glued to her phone more than usual. We were always the kind of couple that shared every little funny text we got, but then, suddenly, she started holding back, being secretive. She'd angle her phone away whenever I got close or lock the screen as soon as I sat down beside her. At first, I tried to shrug it off, maybe I was just being paranoid. But when you've been with someone for years, you start to notice when things feel off. And then there were the late nights. Emily worked in advertising, so staying late at the office wasn't unusual, but it started happening more and more often. She'd come home smelling like a different perfume, her hair and makeup still looking fresh, like she'd been somewhere other than work. I'd ask her how her day went, but she'd brush me off, too tired to talk. She'd give me a hollow smile, say she was exhausted, and head straight to bed, leaving me alone in the living room with this growing pit in my stomach. I'll never forget the night I finally snapped. It was past midnight when she walked through the door, and there I was, sitting in the dark like some sort of cliché. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She barely glanced at me, rolling her eyes like I was being ridiculous. "I told you, I had a late meeting," she said, kicking off her heels and making her way to the bathroom. But this time, I couldn't let it slide. A meeting that goes until midnight? Come on, Emily, what's really going on? She didn't even bother turning around. Work is just really stressful right now. Can we not do this tonight? That was her go-to excuse, stress from work. And maybe, just maybe, I was reading too much into it. But there was something about the way she said it. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Something just didn't sit right. And then there was Mike. He'd been my best friend for years, through thick and thin, college, first jobs, breakups, all of it. But suddenly, he started keeping his distance. No more impromptu hangouts on the weekends, no more grabbing a few beers after work. He always had some reason, work stuff, family obligations, whatever. But the worst part was, even when we did manage to see each other, he seemed jittery, distracted, like he was waiting for a bomb to drop. It wasn't just me who picked up on it, either. Some of our mutual friends started throwing in little comments about how Mike seemed off lately. I remember one night when we were out at a bar, one of the guys leaned over after a couple of drinks and asked, "Hey, what's going on with Mike? He's been acting strange." I laughed it off and said something like, "Yeah, probably just swamped with work." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I'd been through a rough first marriage, so I thought maybe I was just projecting my insecurities. But the red flags kept adding up, and it became impossible to ignore. Then one day, Emily changed the password on her phone. Now, I get it, couples don't have to share every little thing. But this was different. We'd always been open with each other about stuff like that. We trusted each other, or at least, I thought we did. Suddenly, it felt like I was living with a stranger. Every time I tried to bring it up, I got the same tired responses, "It's just work. I'm tired. You're reading too much into things, but I wasn't fine." I felt like I was suffocating, like the woman I'd married was slipping further and further away from me, and I had no idea how to reach her. And then I did something I'm not exactly proud of. I started snooping through her phone. I've never been one to invade someone's privacy, but I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I had to know, was I going crazy, or was there really something going on behind my back? But no matter how many times I checked, I never found a thing. No suspicious messages, no strange calls, just the usual work emails and group chats. Still, the more I looked, the more convinced I became that I was missing something, that I wasn't seeing the whole picture. One night, after another one of those so-called late meetings, I couldn't keep my suspicions bottled up any longer. I looked her straight in the eyes and asked, "Are you cheating on me?" She froze, just for a second, a heartbeat, really, but it was enough. Then she turned and gave me this look, like I was being ridiculous. "Seriously? After everything we've been through, you think I'm cheating?" Her words stung, but what hurt more was the way she said them. It was too smooth, too perfect, like she'd rehearsed it. I wanted to believe her, God knows I did. I wanted so badly to be wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was lying. And Mike? He was lying, too. I wasn't just on the verge of losing my wife. I was losing my best friend. But instead of blowing up right then and there, I did what anyone desperate for answers would do, I stayed quiet. I watched. I waited. I started piecing it all together while pretending I didn't suspect a thing. Every time Emily went out, every time Mike had yet another excuse, I logged it away in my mind, like I was building a case. Because when the truth finally came out, I wanted to be ready. Even though a part of me still clung to this flimsy hope that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But the signs kept stacking up, and they were getting impossible to ignore. The breaking point came one weekend. We had a family dinner planned, something we'd had set in stone for weeks. Emily was always big on family, so I knew how much it meant to her. Then, at the very last minute, she cancelled, said there was a work emergency she had to deal with. It didn't add up. Why bail on something so important for an excuse that flimsy? That's when I realized I couldn't keep turning a blind eye. I thought maybe I could lean on Mike, try to blow off some steam, so I gave him a call. But he didn't pick up. Not once. I left messages, sent texts, even checked his social media, nothing but dead silence. In that moment, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I needed real answers, not just more doubts swirling around in my head. The next morning, I did something I never imagined I'd have to do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Greg, plain, unassuming. He wasn't flashy, but he didn't need to be. He sat there, listening as I poured out the whole mess, Emily's odd behavior, Mike's sudden distance, the late nights, the secrets. He didn't ask many questions, just jotted down notes like he'd seen this scenario play out 1,000 times. How long do these kinds of things usually take? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. Greg didn't even look up. Depends. Sometimes a few days, sometimes a couple of weeks, he replied flatly. But if there's something going on, we'll find it. That little word "if" was all I had left to cling to, hoping, praying, that this was all just some misunderstanding. Maybe it was just stress, maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I already knew better. It didn't take long. 3 days later, Greg called. His voice was steady, like he'd delivered bad news so many times it barely registered anymore. "I think you'll want to see this," he said. We met at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, Barrett's Coffee House. It was nothing special, but it was out of the way, discreet. Greg handed me a manila envelope, and my hands were trembling as I reached for it. I wasn't ready to open it, but at the same time, I couldn't wait any longer. Inside were photos, clear, undeniable pictures of Emily and Mike together. And not just casually together. No, this was more. Holding hands at a bar, walking into a hotel, her laughing up at him the way she used to look at me. I felt my stomach twist in knots. I thought I might be sick. But that wasn't even the worst part. Greg had gone above and beyond. There were text messages printed out, screenshots of their conversations, and even a grainy video from a hotel security camera. There they were, arms around each other, disappearing behind a door. I just sat there, staring at the evidence, struggling to breathe. Even with everything laid out so plainly, I didn't want to believe it. But there it was, Emily, the woman I'd built my whole life around, and Mike, the man I trusted like a brother, sneaking around behind my back for months. I must have sat there for hours, just staring at those photos and texts, trying to wrap my head around it. Greg didn't say much, he didn't have to. He just sat there, letting me process it all at my own pace. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to ask, "How long?" He shrugged, glancing down at his notes. "Best guess. A few months, maybe longer." A few months. They'd been carrying on behind my back for months. I felt a surge of rage, the kind that makes you want to scream until your lungs give out, to break something, anything, to confront them both right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I quietly thanked Greg, slid the envelope into my bag, and walked out of the cafe. I drove home in a fog, my mind a storm of anger and betrayal, but I knew I had to keep it together. That night, I didn't sleep at all. All I could think about was how the two people I trusted more than anyone had been stabbing me in the back this whole time. Emily, the woman I'd given my heart to, and Mike, the guy I would have laid down in traffic for. And they thought they'd gotten away with it. But they were wrong. As the hours crept by, my mind began to shift. I wasn't going to explode, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. No, I was going to hit them where it hurt the most. For Emily, that meant our marriage. And for Mike, that meant his precious career. Mike worked for a high-profile company, and image was everything to him. He was always bragging about his spotless record, how he was in line for a big promotion. He strutted around like he had it all together. But I knew exactly where to strike. First, I needed more evidence. Sure, Greg had already given me enough, but I wanted more, something that would leave no room for doubt. I had Greg tail them for another week, gathering more dirt. It wasn't hard. Emily and Mike were reckless, acting like they'd never be caught. More dinners, more hotels, even a weekend getaway. It all made me sick to watch it unfold, but I forced myself to stay patient. Every move they made, every careless laugh and stolen kiss, I tucked away, slowly piecing together a perfect trap. Because when I finally made my move, there'd be no denying it. No escape for either of them. And in the end, I'd be the one to walk away. They weren't even bothering to be discreet anymore. They'd meet up at hotels, even took a weekend trip together. It was like they didn't care who saw them. Once I'd collected all the proof I needed, I started setting up the pieces for what was coming next. David's company had a strict code of conduct, especially when it came to anything that could put their image at risk. If I played it right, I could take his whole career down with just a few well-placed documents. I typed up an anonymous email address to the HR department, attaching everything, photos, texts, and a note explaining how his affair was a direct threat to the company's reputation. I didn't forget to mention that he was up for a promotion, just to twist the knife a little deeper. But I didn't hit send right away. I wanted them both to sweat a little longer, to keep thinking they were getting away with it. Every time Emily came home late, every time she lied to my face, I just smiled to myself. She had no idea what was coming. And Mike? He hadn't reached out in weeks. I guess he was too busy messing around with my wife to bother checking on his so-called best friend. Finally, after weeks of quietly watching them, I sent the email. And you know what? I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. They deserved every single bit of what was headed their way. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Revenge isn't something you rush. If you want to do it right, you need to be patient, calm, and methodical. I wasn't going to let my emotions get the better of me. After everything they'd put me through, I had to make sure I got it perfect. I had to strike where it would hurt the most. After sending the email to Mike's HR, I didn't just sit back and wait. I kept gathering more dirt, making sure my case was airtight. Greg stayed on their trail, and with each new piece of evidence, it felt like another nail in their coffin. I knew their every move, where they met up, when they sneaked off, every last secretive moment. It was almost laughable how sloppy they'd become, as if they thought no one would ever catch on. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They'd go out in public, acting like a regular couple. I tracked every bit of it, lunches, after-work drinks, even when they took that supposed business trip together. But here's what really sealed the deal: social media. They thought they were being slick, posting vague pictures of sunsets, fancy dinners, and hotel lobbies. But to anyone paying attention, it was obvious. David would post a shot from a work event with a glass of wine, and an hour later, Emily would upload a picture from the exact same spot. They might as well have been waving around a neon sign that said, "We're together." I saved every single thing: screenshots, timestamps, comments. It was all part of the plan. David's perfect image as a devoted family man was about to implode, and I was going to be the one to make it happen. See, David wasn't just some regular office guy. He had ambitions, always bragging about how he was the top contender for a big promotion, how much his bosses respected him, how clean his record was. He'd built this whole persona around being the ideal husband, the doting dad, the guy who always put his family first. And people believed it. But no one knew the real David, no one but me. And that's exactly where I planned to hit him. Right at the heart of his career. But before I dropped the hammer on his job, I needed to sow the seeds of doubt in our social circle first. You can't just hit people with a bombshell like this all at once. It has to creep in slowly, taking root in their minds like poison. I started small, making casual comments to our mutual friends, nothing direct, just enough to make them think. I'd drop lines like, "Hey, have you noticed Mike's been acting a little strange lately?" Or, "Emily's been working a lot of late nights recently, seems like she's hardly ever home anymore." I didn't need to say much. People love thinking they're privy to some hidden truth. Once I planted those little doubts, the gossip took care of the rest. It spread, and before long, the rumors circled back to me. I played my role perfectly, the concerned husband, just doing his best to keep everything together. "Yeah, it's been tough," I'd say, lowering my voice as if I were letting them in on something personal. "Emily's been distant, but we're trying to work through it." The stage was set. I wasn't just aiming to ruin Mike's career, I wanted to unravel everything he cared about, his friendships, his reputation, his entire life. Mike had always been the guy everyone looked up to, the one who seemed to have it all together. But when I was done, no one would ever see him the same way again. While the whispers did their job, I kept a close eye on his work situation. HR had received my anonymous email, but they were slow to act. I knew it would take time for them to dig into things, but that was fine by me. I wasn't in a hurry, I wanted them to find every crack for themselves. Meanwhile, I kept gathering dirt, making sure I had every detail lined up perfectly. Greg stayed on their trail, collecting more photos, more texts, more evidence, each new piece another nail in the coffin I was building for them. And then, I hit the part I'd been looking forward to the most, talking to Mike's wife. She was completely in the dark about what her supposedly perfect husband had been up to. I didn't have to say much, just asked a few questions about how things were going with Mike, how their kids were doing. She gushed about what a wonderful husband and father he was, how he was always so dedicated, so present. It took every ounce of willpower not to burst out laughing. Keeping a straight face, knowing what I knew, was harder than I'd imagined. Every once in a while, a pang of guilt would hit me. After all, she adored him, and their kids, they didn't deserve any of this. They were just collateral damage in his mess. But then I'd think back to the images of them together, the texts, the lies, and every shred of sympathy vanished in a heartbeat. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between Mike and me became more and more obvious. People around us started noticing the shift. Our friends would ask why we hadn't been hanging out, why things seemed different. I just shrugged it off, tossing out vague comments like, "People change, I guess." But I could see it in their eyes, they were dying for the full story. And soon enough, they'd get it. Finally, the moment for the real takedown arrived. You see, revenge isn't just about getting even, it's about timing. You need to strike when it'll cause the most damage, when it'll leave the biggest mark. That's what I had in mind when I planned the event. This wasn't going to be some quiet confrontation, whispered behind closed doors. No, it needed to be loud, messy, and unforgettable. So, I waited until the perfect moment. There was a big company function coming up, one of those swanky dinners where everyone and their spouses show up. The kind of event where all eyes are on you, and a scandal could go viral before dessert is even served. Mike, with his spotless image, would be there, grinning like the golden boy he pretended to be. Emily would be at his side, smiling like the dutiful wife. It was the perfect stage for what I had in mind. I made sure all the key players would be there, friends, co-workers, everyone who mattered to Mike. I needed them all to see it, to watch as his carefully constructed life crumbled right in front of them. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about showing everyone who he really was. About making sure that when he fell hard. When the night finally came, I was ready. I had all the evidence queued up, every dirty secret wrapped in a neat little package. I waited for the room to fill, for the laughter to reach that perfect hum, for Mike to be basking in the attention. And then, I struck. Emily and Mike weren't going to feel my wrath behind closed doors. No, I wanted to expose them in front of everyone who mattered to them, friends, family, colleagues. This needed to be out in the open. I rented out a swanky venue, the kind you'd use for a big corporate bash or a milestone celebration. It had to look innocent, like just another friendly gathering. I sent out the invitations carefully, making sure everyone who needed to be there would show up, our mutual friends, people from Mike's office, and even a few of his senior executives, the ones whose opinions really counted. If I was going to take him down, it had to be in front of the people whose respect he held dear. I didn't hold back with Emily's family, either. Her parents had always been supportive of us, and I knew this would shatter them. But they needed to see what their daughter had been up to, too. No one would be spared from witnessing what was about to unfold. In the days leading up to the event, I practiced my speech over and over. It had to be flawless. This wasn't going to be some emotional outburst. I needed to be calm, collected, like I was just presenting the cold, hard facts. Facts that no one could deny. I had everything lined up, photos, videos, texts, all queued up to display on a big screen for everyone to see. I even hired a tech guy to make sure there wouldn't be any hiccups. This wasn't just revenge, it was going to be a public execution. The night of the event finally arrived. The venue buzzed with lively conversation. People were laughing, drinking, catching up on life, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Emily was there too, acting like the perfect wife, her smile wide and charming as she mingled with everyone, pretending our life was picture perfect. And Mike? He was moving through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, trading jokes, full of confidence, clueless that his entire world was about to crumble. I stayed in the background, watching them both. It was almost amusing, in a dark way, seeing how secure they felt, how convinced they were that they'd pulled it off. They had no idea what was waiting for them. When the moment was right, I made my move. I stepped up to the front of the room, where everyone could see me. The lights dimmed, and slowly, the conversations faded as the crowd turned their attention toward me. I tapped the microphone, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet room, and took a steadying breath before starting. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice strong and controlled. "It means a lot to have friends, family, and colleagues gathered together like this. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about trust, about how vital it is to know the people closest to you are always there, no matter what." I glanced at Emily, and she looked bewildered, her eyes darting around nervously. Mike, standing near the back, had gone pale as a ghost. He knew something was coming, but he couldn't yet grasp just how devastating it was going to be. "And tonight," I continued, keeping my gaze fixed on the two of them, "I'd like to share something personal. Something that's been weighing on me for a long time." I nodded to the tech guy, and the screen behind me lit up. The first image popped up, Emily and Mike, hand in hand, walking out of a restaurant. There were a few gasps, confused murmurs, as people leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to understand what they were seeing. "Over the past few months," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, "I've learned some things about trust and loyalty. Things that have shaken me to my core. You see, sometimes, the people you think you know best can turn out to be the ones who hurt you the most." The next photo flashed onto the screen, Emily and Mike again, this time sitting close together at a bar, their heads almost touching as they leaned in, laughing at something. The room fell silent, a heavy, uncomfortable hush spreading as the realization dawned on people's faces. Emily's parents were staring at the screen, eyes wide in shock. Mike's boss was frowning, leaning forward as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I thought I knew what my life was," I continued, "but I was wrong. So very wrong." Then came the videos. Short, grainy clips of them slipping into a hotel together, arms around each other, disappearing through the door. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Emily's face was a mask of horror. She stepped forward, mouth opening like she was going to say something, but no words came out. Mike just stood frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a chair. "I'm sharing this tonight," I said, my gaze sweeping the room, "because I think it's time everyone knows the truth. I deserve better than this. And more importantly, I think all of you deserve to know the real story." I let the final images cycle through, screenshots of their texts, snippets of their plans to sneak away, evidence of every lie they'd told. By the time I was done, the room was deathly silent, no one daring to breathe. "Now, I know this might come as a shock," I said softly, "but I needed everyone to see who they really are." I turned away from the screen, facing Emily and Mike directly. "So here's to you both," I finished, my voice steady. "I hope it was worth it." And with that, I stepped back, leaving them standing there, exposed for everyone to see. They thought they'd get away with it. They thought they'd outsmart me. But as I looked around at the stunned faces in the room, I knew, this was just the beginning of their fall. There was a collective gasp from the crowd as the weight of what they were seeing sank in. Emily's face went ghostly pale, and Mike's cocky grin melted away in an instant. "This," I said, pointing to the screen behind me, "is my wife and my best friend, sneaking around behind my back." But I didn't stop there. More images flashed across the screen, Emily and Mike laughing together, holding hands, stealing kisses, and walking into hotels. And then came the text messages, each one like a dagger twisting in their backs. Flirty exchanges, plans for secret meetings, and even cruel jokes at my expense about how clueless I was. The entire room fell silent, except for the low hum of shocked murmurs rolling through the crowd like a wave. Emily stumbled forward, trying to speak, her voice shaky and desperate. It's not what it looks like," she choked out, but no one believed her. The feeble excuses she'd always used had lost their power. There was no spinning the truth now. Mike didn't even attempt to defend himself. He just stood there, rooted in place, as the reality of what was happening crashed down on him. Chaos erupted almost instantly. Friends and family members shouted, demanding answers, their faces twisted in shock and betrayal. Some turned to me, offering support or pity, but I wasn't interested in sympathy. This wasn't about earning anyone's compassion. This was about delivering justice. Emily's parents, seated in the front row, looked utterly destroyed. Her mother's eyes brimmed with tears, and her father sat stiffly, shaking his head slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A small part of me felt a pang of guilt for them, they'd never asked for any of this. But that sympathy burned away fast. They needed to see who their daughter really was. As the accusations flew and the anger boiled over, Emily pushed through the crowd, trying to reach me. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Let's talk about this. It's not what you think." I took a step back, shaking my head slowly. "There's nothing left to talk about, Emily," I said evenly. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." Meanwhile, Mike stood off to the side, completely paralyzed. He knew he was finished. His career, his friendships, his carefully curated reputation, it was all crumbling around him. I saw his bosses, the higher-ups who'd come to the event, whispering among themselves, already working to distance the company from him. The pristine image he'd spent years crafting was shattered beyond repair. I let them both stew in their shame, savoring the way the weight of their actions finally hit them full force. By the end of the night, Emily was a wreck, scrambling to explain herself to anyone who would listen, but no one wanted to hear it. Mike had slunk off to a corner, looking like he was trying to disappear, probably frantically thinking of how he could salvage whatever scraps of his life were left. As the event wound down, people began trickling out, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few came up to me, saying I'd done the right thing, telling me they were proud of me for standing up for myself. But I didn't feel proud. Just hollow. The satisfaction I thought I'd feel was strangely absent. All I knew was that it was finally over. The fallout from that night spread faster than I could have imagined. Within days, everyone knew what had gone down. Emily and Mike's names were whispered in hushed tones in every circle. The aftermath hit Mike first. His bosses got wind of the affair, courtesy of the email I'd sent. His precious promotion. Gone. In fact, they quietly cut ties with him altogether, not wanting to deal with the negative press. His spotless record and sterling reputation. Shattered, obliterated beyond repair. As for Emily, her life unraveled just as quickly. Her family, humiliated by her actions, cut her off. They couldn't stand the shame of it, the embarrassment of everyone knowing what their perfect daughter had done. Friends who'd once admired her looked at her differently now. The social circle she'd once held sway over vanished almost overnight. They thought they could destroy me, leave me broken. But now they were the ones left to pick up the pieces of the wreckage they'd caused. While they scrambled to figure out where it all went wrong, I finally felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't just revenge. This was retribution. Every lie, every betrayal, paid back in full. And I didn't have to lift a finger to destroy them, they'd done it to themselves. For the first time in months, I felt free. Free of the lies, the deceit, the endless wondering. And as I watched their lives unravel from a distance, I realized I didn't need to do anything more. They'd already lost everything that mattered. But even as they faded into the background, disgraced and isolated, I knew this wouldn't be the end for them. People like Emily and Mike always try to claw their way back. The difference now? They'd be climbing alone, through a landscape littered with the ruins of their own making. And I'd be standing far away, watching as they struggled and failed to reclaim what they'd thrown away so carelessly. Because when you destroy someone's trust, you don't just lose them. You lose everything. Our mutual friends, people we'd known for years, turned their backs on her almost overnight. She became a social outcast, the woman who'd betrayed her husband with his closest friend. As for me, I cut her out of my life completely. She tried to get back in, calling, texting, even showing up at my door, sobbing and pleading for forgiveness. But I never answered. She made her choice, and now she had to live with it. I won't lie, watching their worlds crumble gave me a certain grim satisfaction. It felt like justice had finally been served. But once the dust settled, I realized that revenge doesn't fill the emptiness. Even after I'd exposed them for what they were, I was still left standing in the ruins of what I thought was my life. Starting over was harder than I'd imagined. The betrayal cut deep, and for a long time, trusting anyone again seemed impossible. I pulled away from people, shut myself off, and isolated myself in my own little world. Eventually, though, I came to understand that hiding wasn't going to make things better. I had to rebuild. Slowly, I began letting new people into my life, folks who didn't know the whole story, who didn't see me as just the guy whose wife cheated on him. It took time, but eventually, I started to trust again, even if cautiously and with my guard up. For the first time in years, I focused on myself. I picked up old hobbies I'd forgotten about, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, and put myself out there, meeting new people who had no clue about my past. Sure, there were still moments when the hurt would creep back in, when I'd think about the life I thought I had, about the people I believed would never hurt me. But every time those thoughts tried to pull me under, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. I wasn't the broken man they left behind. I was someone who had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. If there's one thing I learned from all this, it's how fragile trust can be. The people you think you know best, the ones you believe would never betray you, can shatter your world in an instant without a second thought. But I also learned something more valuable: you can't control what other people do. You can't make them love you, you can't force them to stay true, no matter how much you give. The only thing you have control over is how you respond when everything falls apart. For the longest time, I blamed myself. I kept thinking I wasn't enough, that I should have seen it coming or done something different. But the truth is, their betrayal wasn't a reflection of me, it was about their own selfishness and lack of honesty. Once I accepted that, I started letting go of the guilt, the anger, and the pain. The most important lesson I took away from all of this is that you have to know your own worth. You can't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. Because at the end of the day, the only person who will always have your back is you. And that's enough. So here I am, living life on my own terms. I'm not out there searching for another relationship. Honestly, I may never actively look for one again, and that's okay. I've learned to be content with myself, without needing someone else to complete me. And in the end, that's the best kind of revenge I could ever ask for, being happy and whole all on my own. The people who tried to tear me down, they're still picking up the pieces of their lives, while I'm finally free, living the way I want to. I don't need anyone else to validate me. And that, right there, is the best victory I could have ever hoped for.